Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the podcast today, we have Fouad Sada. Fouad, welcome.
Hi, Thomas. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, for the lack of better words, I am an entrepreneur. I've been doing this for the past 13 years officially, but I've probably been meddling with entrepreneurship for almost all my life. So since being in school, trying to sell a few basketball cards and posters and whatnot, and getting scammed as well. So that's when you get your first hours of training. I've started 3 businesses in the past 13 years, and I'm starting my 4th as we speak. We're on something, and the company I started recently with my co-founder Pranav Patel has to do with education. We're still kind of in stealth mode. We're part of the On Deck Founders Program in Silicon Valley. So more to come on that later. Most of the businesses I started were not tech businesses, but this one is a tech business. So I am a huge proponent of entrepreneurship, self-employment, starting your own businesses, big or small. I'm of the opinion of going for the larger, bigger home runs, and we'll talk about that later. But I think it's a great risk not to have your own business, especially in the 21st century. And the mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I did want to ask you about, you said that you were, shall we say, entrepreneurial in your younger years. Do you pull any meaning from that at all? Because I know that some people are very interested in, what age you started showing entrepreneurial traits. Do you think that's significant in terms of how you ended up doing business, or is it, what's your thoughts there?
Well, it is significant. In a way, I've always had the propensity to plan things and to be interested in making money. And there's nothing wrong with that, although it's kind of looked at as a bit of a taboo now in society. Businessman or. But I've always been interested in the business world and making and how money is made, and that led me to look into different problems that I can solve. It wasn't the way I looked at it at first. I was looking at things of, okay, how can I make some money there? As you grow, though, you start putting impediments for yourself, and employment seems to be the safest route. Your peers are quick to push you toward that as well. Everybody's getting a job. You get paid with minimal, let's say, risk, although it's still risky, and most people don't want to admit that. Nothing is safe. You could lose your job. The company can go bankrupt, and you could lose everything. Even government pensions can go to zero value, as we've seen in many countries before. So nothing is risk-free. You only have the assumption that it's risk-free. It may be short-term, lower risk, but it's higher risk on a longer timeline. So it has had an influence on me, my earlier ventures, but then I stuck as an employee for about 10 years. I hated that, and then I thought, okay, that's it for me. I'm gonna give up the fake safety of a monthly paycheck and start something I'm willing to risk a lot for.
Did you have any mentors when you were younger who showed you they had their own business, or was everyone employee around you?
Most people were employees around me, but I was fortunate to work for some small business owners, and I learned a lot from them. Some of them were negative mentors, as in I saw what they did that I shouldn't do. So they committed large business mistakes, and these were very important lessons for me. A couple were important mentors in the sense that they did something that I thought was very impressive at that time, and I tried to copy their business model when I first started. Now, reality is when after I started, I realized that you can't copy someone else's model. Eventually, it will break somewhere. Different times, different clients, different situations, and that what may appear to be perfect for you from the outside is not perfect once you're practicing it. But you learn along the way, and you get better quickly if you're willing to consider mistakes and failure as lessons instead of slapping yourself on the face every time you make a mistake, and not really learning from it.
Well, I would like to ask you about your other businesses and your progress and what you learn, but I am conscious of talking to you about topics that you would like to discuss. So what's your preference? Would you prefer to talk about your story, or would you prefer to talk about why it's riskier to not start your own business?
Well, let's start with why it's riskier not to start your own business.
Okay.
And I like to always draw on what of my fellow countryman Nassim Taleb, the author of famous for Black Swan. He also wrote Anti-Fragile and a couple of more successful books. He calls this asymmetric risk. And the gist of it is, if you're making a bet with the possibility of a 1 to 10 return, you'll eventually end up making a lot of money or being successful with your bets, if they're not money related, that is. But employment is the inverse of that. You're not taking much risk, presumably, because you're sticking with an employer, and you're trying to keep that career shiny on a CV so that everything looks good. But the times are changing, and it's not how it used to be. With automation and the quick progress of AI and robotics, the future is going to be very different 20 years from now. It already is much, much different than what it used to be 20 years ago. Times now are moving much faster. Technology is taking over the world. Careers are changing very quickly, and people's jobs are at risk. We know it's coming. We don't know when. So there's no precision on, say, when cars are going to replace all self-driving cars are going to replace all drivers, et cetera, et cetera. But that sort of automation is going to hit almost every industry. So competition is going to go tougher for jobs, and eventually wages are going to go lower unless you're in the top 1%, top 2% of your profession. On the other hand, as an entrepreneur, you're much more grounded because you're seeing developments with your clients, and you're reacting faster than what a company would. So you're adapting your product offerings, your services, and you have more than one client, I hope, and that means you have a diversity of sources of income. And with this massive globalization, you're probably getting clients from different countries and different industries. So if, let's say, recession hits the UK today, you're still doing okay with a few other clients based in the US or in Asia. So that's generally my thoughts around it. It's also important to highlight that it's not that risky. It's not that risky to start a business, at least not in the modern world, where, perhaps there are a few countries where you have, we could get in a lot of trouble if you start a business and it fails. But in most modern economies, that's not the case. You have limited liability. You have some sort of protection, provided that you're not committing fraud, and you can always go back to a job. So you can take a year off and go after that project that you've always been interested in. And money's is easy to get by now. If you have an idea that could potentially benefit millions of people, venture capital is the way to go. You'll find venture capital firms in almost every country today. There are accelerator programs that can help those who are just getting started. I could mention On Deck, Accelerator, ODX, beondeck.com. That is something to look into if you're going the venture way. And if you're looking into starting a small business, then you don't need much. You can start a podcast, set up a website using WordPress or Shopify or Webflow, and either start as a freelance consultant with the experience that you have from your current job and line up a few clients, or start another form of business. So it's really not that difficult. But, taking the dive is, and I hope people who are listening to us today are encouraged to take the dive.
It's interesting because were some things when you proposed the topic that I wanted to get your clarification on. And it's mainly because I had changed my position on this somewhat, from thinking that, everyone should go into business and be an entrepreneur, to when you actually go and do it, and also what the statistics are. Maybe yes. that's not quite the same, but the way you position it with qualifiers, for example, if you were to already be in a job, and let's say you were a part-time job, but you started a business on the side part-time as a freelancer, or for example, and also with all of the technological changes that making it easier for everyone. I mean, that does sound like a very reasonable proposition. But I am interested in what your thoughts are regarding what you said about how it's changed 20 years ago when you started versus now. Would you have the same position 20 years ago as you do now, or is it very much based on the fact that innovation is speeding up and things are going to get very different in the future than they are now? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I had an optimistic outlook on entrepreneurship back then as well, but it was not at the level I have today. So I was pretty impressed, and I can still recall with DHL and FedEx back then, and the ability to send emails and and communicate with companies over the internet. And I remember thinking, oh, it must have been really hard having a business 20 years ago when you couldn't send something overnight to Europe or receive a package in 48 hours from, let's say, New York to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where my business was based. And that's where I lived for quite a long time. Also, communication used to be much more difficult. My parents used to talk about the telex. I never saw a telex machine. I used the fax myself. And most of today's youth have never seen a fax machine. So I think progress really helps, but I'm also with your position that it's much easier now to actually take that risk, even as a side hustle. The famous term now, and I'm not a big fan of the word hustle. Just a note there, but it's much easier now. It's less risky. It's possible to promote yourself, and you could go really small. That was not the case when I first started. You couldn't go really small. You couldn't start a business with a couple $100, at least not where I was. You couldn't easily try and connect with customers by building a guerrilla marketing channel, like a podcast or a social media channel or a mailing list. These things were still done through traditional advertising and promotion agencies and marketing companies, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I spent close to a decade in branding, advertising, and marketing firms because it wasn't that easy to start a business. So, yeah, my position would be slightly different, although still quite optimistic then on entrepreneurship.
So, I mean, coming back to, I mean, all relevant. When you first started your first business, because you had 3 of them, what did that look like?
Oh, that looked pretty impressive for everyone else, but the founders. So yeah, that was a small design firm that 4 of us started, and we weren't really sure what we're going to do. We were from a background of advertising and marketing. One of the co-founders was from print production, etc. And we decided to do something related to advertising and just go after clients, try and get jobs. But that eventually became a signage design company, wayfinding systems, basically, where we consulted, designed these systems, eventually starting a facility because we couldn't find ones that would produce to our specs using designs that weren't off the shelf. And that turned out to be a pretty big opportunity because we end up designing what became the design standard for all signage in Saudi airports, deployed at 24 airports when I was still at the company. I eventually took an exit offer from my partners, and that was my first exit. During that business, the same my partners and I also found another opportunity because an RFP came to us by mistake, and we thought, okay, maybe we can spend some time working on this. But because the contract and the opportunity was so big, we ended up starting another business because of that. It was a safety equipment business, supply to the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, mostly from the US and Europe. And that only happened because we were in the game. So you can't really get these opportunities if you were a viewer, if you're sitting on the bench. You need to be playing the game of business for these serendipities to kind of line up. As they say, luck favors the prepared mind. If you're actually working, if you're open to opportunities, when luck lines up, you actually benefit from it. So I took an exit then from both these businesses and started a third business that was in construction. So I thought, okay, how difficult can this be? Construction contracts are big and profitable, and I have a lot of contacts in the industry. Let me start this business. Had no experience in architecture or engineering, so it was a very bumpy beginning. The first 2 years, especially, but that eventually became profitable. We worked on industrial projects, commercial projects, residential projects. I learned a lot from that. We could expand on that if you have specific questions. I think that was the most valuable training I received in business, working in construction. And that's because you work with all types of people. So you work with tradespeople who were less educated, let's say, than you normally would work, say, when you're dealing with a marketing agency, and you have to adjust your approach to make things work with them and for them. And then there are different lines of hierarchies there, separating management from the people on the on your work sites. So things can go bad really quickly because you can't be in all these places at the same time. It's very different, say, from running an agency with 50 people in one office. And the number of people who are working for you very quickly scale. Even if they're not directly under your employment, they're, let's say, subcontractors of different trades. You could have one project with 150 people working at a given time. 3 projects of these, you have close to a 500 person operation. And if you're the leader or the CEO in specific, you're responsible for pretty much everything. So I learned a lot of lessons there, some very expensive lessons as well. Lessons on leadership, on hiring, mostly through the mistakes I committed. I wasn't particularly good at hiring people in the beginning, especially that I did not understand these trades really well. I also didn't know how to measure success for the people I hired. But I had to quickly learn and adjust. And I also had to understand how these relationship dynamics worked with my team, my engineers, subcontractors and the people that worked for them. So you have to think of everything from protecting the wages for people who are not directly under your employ, the employees of your subcontractors. Because if you don't, when shit hits the fan, you're in charge. It affects your project, it affects your reputation, everything just tumbles. So that was a very big adventure for me. I eventually learned that you can't scale a construction company at high speed. You want to scale a construction company, you get a project, you issue a guarantee bond, you hire more people, and you keep repeating that for 30, 40 years. And that's when I decided that's not what I want to do. And you're stuck to one locale, one geography. So I worked out an agreement with my partner then to get an earn-out deal, and decided to look into something else, a new adventure. That's when I decided to get a master's degree. Ended up doing one with HEC Paris. It was a full online program. And that's when COVID started. So I was lucky. It was an online program because everything became an online program at that point. That's where I met my co-founder, Kunal Patel, who's based in San Francisco. We became friends very quickly, and we started meddling with the idea of eventually starting something after we graduated. And here we are doing that now.
Well, before we get into the details of the new business, I did have some clarification questions. So in your first business, you got an offer of an exit. Was that a positive thing for you? Did you feel good about the fact that you could get out, or what were the details there?
Well, to be quite honest, there was some conflict between the partners at that point. And we didn't design a framework, and that's largely my fault. I was CEO. We didn't design a framework for resolving differences in vision and tactics or strategies between the partners. We also didn't have a clear, let's say, a clear partners agreement that detailed how we would resolve such conflict, whose vote would overrule, etc., etc. So things became very uncomfortable for a few months prior to that offer. So I was quite happy to take it at that point. I no longer wanted to be in a setup where things became unfriendly.
So you were happy to go, but it wasn't necessarily a positive experience. What do you learn from that now?
Well, first to begin with, be very careful when choosing a partner. It's like in marriage, and you're likely to be stuck for at least 10 years with each other. So that's the first lesson. Lesson number 2, have clarity on equity from the beginning. Have a vesting agreement, because people's motivations change, and when they do, and you don't see that partners are putting an equal effort into the venture, you're going to become resentful. And when these things don't get resolved, it's going to destroy the business relationship. So vesting agreement, clear terms, a clear model for compensation for people who make the most effort. Well, these are the things I learned from that.
I did speak to, I've had a lawyer on the podcast before, and he said that the biggest mistake that entrepreneurs or business owners make is that they just do sort of handshake agreements. They don't put things in writing. So it's a reiteration of that point. You talked about the second business, but we need some more details there. What's the second business? How did that come about? And I suppose, how did that go?
Yeah, the second business was an industrial / safety equipment supply business. And that came about because one of our clients sent an RFP package, which was quite large. And we weren't supposed to get it, I think, because we weren't categorized for that sort of business with them. But when we spoke to them, they said, "Hey, if you can send a proposal, we'll be happy to entertain it." So we made a few calls. I made a few calls at that point to companies that I knew of in the US, and quickly managed to get the proposals and data sheets together. Quickly was like 3 weeks. And we sent in our proposal. A few months after that, we received an award. We weren't expecting it at that point. And when we got that, we found that now we have a new operation to manage, because it was we had to deal with its logistics, with different sorts of finance challenges or credit instruments, etc. And the opportunity was big enough to allow us to explore other clients who are looking for the same products in the market where we existed. So I signed a couple of deals with companies in the US that made our life much easier, because now we had more product offerings to clients in Saudi Arabia, and we set up a sales team. We started exploring more customers, and that became very lucrative and potentially the most. I think it was the most profitable business that I ran in terms of margins.
Wow! So the
not in
second
terms
business
of total turnover.
It exists because you get sent a request, presumably with a budget. So they said, like, this is our budget, and you think, maybe I can do that. That's how that business existed.
Yes,
it's fascinating, isn't it? That
it is. It is.
Did you presumably you had your partners in the second business were different from the first, or did you?
No, they were the same.
Oh, okay.
No, they were just
Interesting.
Yeah, but we decided to fund it from the first business.
Okay.
And that was also probably not very, in retrospect, not very wise. We should have, had clear lines there as well. We should have set up a new agreement around that instead of another handshake. But overall, it turned out to be positive.
Well, in some instances, your existing businesses can lead to other perhaps businesses which have a higher barrier of entry. Do you think that's relevant there?
Can you rephrase the question? I think I missed part of it.
So some businesses are very difficult to get into unless you have some sort of initial funding or some background. Would that help you?
Yeah, definitely. Well, in this case, for instance, we were already a registered vendor with that client, and we had gone above a certain threshold of billing. So we were on their system. They're a very big oil company, so everything is pretty systematized there. We were categorized at a level where we qualified to actually do that job or get that offer. So, and the same thing happened as well in construction. When I first started, I was getting very small jobs because I had no portfolio. My team and I were all pretty young and didn't have much to show for. And then we ended up, hiring people with more experience where we could leverage their experience when we're pitching for something. And then we also built a portfolio that made it easier for us to get jobs. We essentially built trust, some sort of trust for future customers.
So are either of the first or second businesses, they still around? Do you know?
Yeah, they're all still around.
And you're separate from them now. You don't have any more. Okay. And how does the exit from the second one happen?
The second one was part of the. It was a deal with the first one as well. So it was a combined deal. Yeah, because they were the same partners, and I think we all decided that it's time to part. Okay. So.
And your construction company, which is your third business, what were you building?
Initially, we weren't building much. We were just doing renovation works, electrical works, stuff like that. And then we started building out small facilities at airports because I had existing relationships with clients. So small fuel stations and temporary residences and that sort of stuff, security rooms. And then we grew into building parts of commercial properties, as well as one of the larger projects was at the Jeddah International Airport. There was infrastructure works. And eventually we focused on residential. And that was quite a change in terms of types of clients and the types of challenges that you deal with. But it was also more personal, more interesting.
And how does that come about, the third business? Sorry if you've already said it. I don't recall how you got into it.
Oh, well, it also kind of aligned because I had seen that some opportunities existed with my conversation with existing clients. So I already had a network of people, and they had some work available that I knew if I could put a crew together. I already had trust established with some of them. I could take some of these projects. But it also happened that I couldn't get, as a foreigner, I couldn't easily get a business license for an advertising or a marketing firm. That's what I was intending to do at that point. They had basically said, we've issued enough of these, and unless it's, I think it was construction and something else. I don't remember what the other thing was. These are your choices. I was working with a lawyer back then. Yeah, and he said, well, the opportunities, the time, it's becoming more and more difficult for us to get a license now. So these are the two choices. What do you pick? And I'm like, okay, construction. Let's see how we can grow with that. So these are challenges most people who are listening to the show now will not have. Starting a business in the UK is a 10-minute process. And the same thing applies in the US. a bit more complex in some European countries, but it's also not highly restrictive. So yeah, listeners, please, build upon these opportunities.
That is amazing, though. The fact that you got a couple of options, and presumably the construction company sounds quite successful based on the number of people that you had on projects, and as you said, it was scaling quite quickly. You made something quite significant from the restrictions that you had. Is that how you interpret it as well?
Yes, I do. A precise interpretation, I would say.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But I did want to pick up quickly on the hiring. That you mentioned the fact that you made some hiring mistakes, and the mistakes are very, very good to learn from, but also the solutions you get from that for going forward. So have you got anything to share there?
Yeah, sure. Well, when you're working in an industry that you don't understand yet, first, I would say try to work on an industry that you understand. Well, that's lesson number one. If you don't have that chance, and if you're excited about something that you still don't understand, that's fine, as long as you're passionate and driven. But then try and consult with people who have an experience there. When hiring, primarily you need to focus on how you measure success for these candidates. And one would think, hey, it's easy, let's say you have a sales team, you focus on sales numbers, etc. But it's not the same if you have a project management team and civil engineers, architects, people on the field, foremen and supervisors, superintendents. How do you know that they're doing the job right? How do you know that that you're measuring the right things? You initially don't. So try and figure out what these metrics are very quickly. And in the beginning, you have no choice but to work on a very tight turnaround with everyone. So I would recommend daily meetings instead of weekly ones with key decision makers in your company. So you're constantly getting updates, constantly asking the right questions. Also, keeping a very tight loop with customers and clients so that you're getting any feedback about things going wrong rather quickly. It's not going to make sense that you're on every job site, for instance, in construction at the same time. You're going to try to do that, but that won't work. That's why you're hiring a team. And also be very selective about the people you hire. So develop a rigorous way for testing people. If you can test candidates on project basis or freelance basis in the beginning, even if it's more expensive, do that. So, start with a dating period and then an engagement period before plunging in. And when you're hiring, try to hire for what you believe is a good fit for the next year or two, not the next 10. As a small business, it doesn't matter if you get a finance manager who's a 20-year veteran, but can't get you, has great connections and has seen it all, big and small, but can't basically get you a small credit line. That's the thing that you need right now. So you need to, on one hand, look at the long-term perspective of things. On another hand, you need to keep that long-term kind of framed properly, 12 to 24 months. these are the people that you need, these are the skills that you need, this is how much you can afford, and keep reassessing. Also, you will have to fire people. So when you know that someone is repeatedly failing the company, failing their colleagues, failing their clients, and the company culture, it's time to let them go. Don't keep that thing dragging, because you're just not experienced in firing people. That's how everybody starts. I wasn't experienced at that. I'm not saying it's fun. I'm not saying be insensitive about it. Of course not. But you're not doing anyone any good by sabotaging the company and the rest of the team.
It's a good point. So how does the third business, how does that, what's the exit look like for you?
So that wasn't what I would call the soft exit. I still own some shares of the company. I took an earnout, paid over 3 years for another part of the shares, and my partner at the business assumed ownership for my shares with an initial investor. But what happened at that point was I knew I no longer wanted to be in construction. I said, okay, let's figure out a deal where we don't blow this up, and the period of, let's say, transition period is long enough for you to be comfortable with keeping the operation going and keeping everything together, hiring people where for the responsibilities that, let's say, I was assuming. And we figured out a deal where I left the company after 12 months from the first, from when we initiated the talks, without massively affecting the company's cash flow in one hit. And I then went on soul searching, on a long period of soul searching.
Was it education after that, though, right?
Yes, yeah.
But
during education, there was a lot of soul searching as well.
Well, I don't know much about the new business, so would you like to share a little bit about that, and then also about what your goals are for the new company?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's very early stage. We're still validating the hypothesis of what we're working on. We're currently part of the On Deck Founders Program. It's starting next week, and what we're working on at the moment is related to income sharing agreements. So what we want to, I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's a new type of financing model, especially in education. And our goals are basically to help today's underdogs become tomorrow's champions through higher education by giving them access to funds that they otherwise wouldn't have. We believe ISAs align the interests of the investors. So what we're building is essentially a marketplace, and it aligns the interests of the student, the investor, and the educational institution together. Happy to expand on anything if you have some questions there.
Well, in terms of what your motivations are, is that more around philanthropy, or is it for profit, or is it just sort of happy medium? Do you get both of them?
It's definitely for profit, but it's also purpose driven, because we both Kunal and I thought a lot about this, that we don't want to be stuck with something for, let's say, the next 7 or 10 years that we're not passionate about. And at that point, we decided to do something related to education. But then we quickly learned that academia is even more bureaucratic than governments. So their sales cycles are extremely tedious and political. So we looked into other problems or other challenges that students face after talking to a couple of dozen of students, we found that most of them had some sort of financial challenge getting their degrees. Either some challenges, let's say, getting the necessary financing for the last 2 years or the last year, so they had to stop studying and then maybe work for a semester and go back to school, etc., which prolonged things for them. While others simply didn't go for the school of their choice because they couldn't afford it. And we think income sharing agreements are a good alternative to let's say bank loans or other sort of commitments that don't give you the guarantee of what an income sharing agreement does. So basically, if you don't get employed with the degree that you've earned, you don't have to pay anything. It's contingent on getting a job above a certain threshold. Granted, it is a form of debt, but it's contingent debt. So that means we have to vet the institution and make sure that their program actually gets people employed. And our investors are going to make sure that our algorithms, our selection criteria for the students themselves, give them a good level of safety when they're investing in that person's future. A good way to look at it, it's like venture capital, but instead of going into a company, it's going into an individual, and it's on a fixed period instead of perpetual.
Interesting. I can see it's very scalable. So if it could work, it could, you could impact a lot of people that way. Well, I'm interested to know how it goes. So do let me know how you get on with it, and I'm sure there'll be some more learnings. And I appreciate what you've shared today, because I think there's a lot of good lessons in there. Is there anything I should have asked you about?
No, I don't think so.
Is it like, do you feel like it's a form of therapy? Have you gone through the whole business life cycle there?
It is. I can fairly say so. Yes, it's not always. It's not. I don't do this very often. Go through the whole process of retrospecting the past decade or so, but it's always quite valuable for me to share these lessons, and I hope that people actually learn from my mistakes so that they could commit their own. I mean, they're still going to commit mistakes, but if you can afford to, if you can avoid mine and save some money there, that's better. And some money and some hair, I guess.
If people want to connect with you, where do they find you?
Well, it's best to find me on LinkedIn, and my LinkedIn ID is Sadr, SADR. I'm also available on Medium, and I try and write a couple of articles a month. That's fouadsadr.medium.com.
Fouad, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's been a lovely conversation.